Newspapers are the window to the world for the communities they serve, venues for public discussion, marketplaces for commerce, and a source of entertainment. They share in the failures and successes of their communities and ultimately in their growth. Few newspapers exemplify the newspaper-community relationship better than the Evansville Courier. Lawyer William Newton published the first Courier on January 7, 1845, 2 years before Evansville received its charter. Indeed, Evansville and the Courier have grown together. The newspaper went through repeated ownership and name changes during the first 20 years before the Courier name stuck.
Well, there actually are two Couriers and lots of things in between. The first Courier began around the year 1845. Courier was a common name in the Ohio Valley for papers that supported the Democratic Party, particularly President Polk and Jacksonian Democrats. There was a Courier in Louisville, for example. But that paper lasted perhaps a year. Between that time and perhaps a bit earlier and 1865, there was a series of relatively short-lived newspapers that were affiliated with the Democratic Party.
Charles Denby, who would have a cigar named after him and serve as U.S. Minister to China, was among investors who brought back the Courier name.
Newspapers attracted lots of enterprising young men to towns like Evansville. The Enquirer attracted Charles Denby, who became prominent in local politics and the law, and was one of those people who invested in the Democratic newspaper during the Civil War era. In the early part of 1865, after the short-lived effort with the Times, which was renamed something else, a group of investors, including Denby, organized a paper which they called the Courier, and it began to publish a daily and a weekly edition. And that paper has stuck since 1865.
George William Shanklin acquired the Courier in 1866 and was joined 2 years later by his brother John Gilbert. Both were involved in Democratic politics and catered to their Democratic audience.
Newspapers were unabashedly partisan, and people in those days were one thing or the other. And so they bought their newspapers not according to whether it appeared in the morning or the afternoon, but rather which party it supported.
The Shanklins held the Courier with a brief interruption in ownership until 1897, when the widow of John Gilbert Shanklin sold it to a group of prominent investors.
Henry Murphy, Percy Carroll, and Howard Rusa acquired the Courier in 1897 from the widow of John Shanklin, according to the source I consulted. And all of these people, of course, became interested in Evansville affairs, particularly Howard Rusa, who served, among other things, as a member of the school board of Benjamin Bosse. And of course, the school is named in his honor.
Politics was at the heart of the next ownership change. It came during the turbulent period of Prohibition and Red Scare labor upheavals.
The Courier grew increasingly restless with Bosse's leadership. There were concerns about particularly allegations of vote buying. There were also concerns about abuse of or violation of the new liquor law. And these concerns were, in fact, fairly well grounded. A mayoral election was upcoming, and for some unaccountable reason, Benjamin Bosse was able to acquire the paper. The paper was purchased by Henry Marshall of Lafayette, I believe, who within several months sold some interest to Mayor Bosse, who in turn acquired full control of the paper and was reelected in November 1921 and died in April of the following year.
By the time Bosse had bought the Courier, cartoonist Carl K. Knecht already was on his way to becoming an institution in Evansville. His often hard-hitting cartoons began appearing on the front page of the Courier within a week of his arrival in 1906.
The first cartoon, September 29th of 1906, was on the front page, and it remained on the front page until 1952.
Knecht also became the Courier's first photographer and coupled that new skill with another interest he had, flying. He was the first Evansville resident to fly, and in 1919 shot the first aerial photographs of the city. Knecht's interests often were reflected in the 18,000 cartoons he drew during his 54-year career. At the forefront were the circus and the zoo. He played a huge role in developing the zoo, initially with animals he had received from the circus, and later with a fund drive he promoted for the first elephant, Kay. Knecht was among the city's biggest boosters, promoting new business, commercial air traffic, and a national highway system that would include Evansville.
I think he was a booster, and also very much involved in boosterism in terms of trying to improve the quality of life. Supported every major civic organization, particularly in support of the Red Cross. He probably drew more cartoons about the Red Cross than any other civic institution.
Knecht was highly respected by his peers, and a number of his cartoons were published nationwide.
He became an institution in the community as well as at the Courier. And there were people around the country who knew nothing about Evansville other than it was the place where Carl Knecht was from.
Bosse's death in 1922 left the Courier in the hands of his widow Anna, and was the advent of the Enlow family's involvement in the newspaper.
In the wake of Benjamin Bosse's death, his widow Anna acquired primary or controlling interest in the paper. Another major investor was the National City Bank president, C.B. Enlow, about whom a great deal needs to be written in the history of this city. But Anna was the principal owner until her death in 1939, when Enlow's son Robert then became publisher, succeeding Anna.
Also about this time, political partisanship began to disappear in newspapers.
In approximately 1924, the Courier hired Donald Sissom to serve as editor, and he held that position until the early part of 1954. Under Sissom, I would think it's fair to say that the Courier became much less partisan, perhaps a reflection of the ownership of the newspaper, perhaps also a reflection of the changing times and of the role of newspapers in that time.
Newspapers also were changing the way they treated race. During the turn of the century, racial content that appeared in white-run newspapers, and the Courier in particular, would be embarrassing by today's standards. It certainly reflected intolerant times in our society. Under Sissom's leadership, the Courier took giant steps to shed its blatantly racist ways.
Don Sissom probably was doing a great deal behind the scenes to improve, along with some other local leaders. Was doing a lot of things to improve the racial climate in this community, and probably the most notable thing that I can point to is an event that was held in the summer of 1944 in Evansville, the first regional conference on race ever held in the history of this community. It was remarkable not just for that, but also because of the way it was covered. The Courier gave it prominent coverage for several days.
In 1937, the Ohio Valley was inundated by a tremendous flood. A flood that would change Evansville and the way its newspapers were produced. The Courier and the press formed a joint operating agreement, which continues to confuse local residents about newspaper ownership here.
Right after the 1937 flood, and before I was born, but the story that I read and believe probably is that I think one of the papers was closer to the river during the flood and was flooded out of its building, and the other papers said, "Oh, come up in our building and we'll print you until the water goes down." And once they got in the same building, everybody saw what a great savings was involved in one building, one printing press, one set of everything instead of two. So they eventually formed what is called a joint operating agreement. This was one of the first ones in country, and the two newspapers have always been separately owned.
On December 7th, 1941, the United States was thrust into World War II by the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Like elsewhere in American society, change was on the horizon for the Courier. With the manpower-draining demands of the military and higher-paying jobs in war plants, women began more than ever to assume roles in the newsroom beyond the society pages. Chickie Freeberg worked for the Courier and the Sunday Courier and Press during the war. She reported on news and sports and even found herself behind a camera on occasion.
Before the war, I think the women were doing mostly society and fashions and go to teas and style shows, that kind of stuff, lighter stuff, although there were some who did some regular reporting, but mostly it was the lighter things. But then when the war came along, then all of a sudden, the women had to take over more of the duties that the guys had been doing. So that's where we got into doing everything.
Unemployment in Evansville was virtually non-existent because of the war. That brought to an end one of the longest-running Courier contributions to the community, the annual Christmas party for poor children. But the war brought other needs, and the newspapers moved in to help.
The Courier and the press together sponsored the Red Cross Canteen, which was located near the old L&N Railroad Station on Fulton Avenue. The canteen was a very, very important facility here in Evansville. It put Evansville on the map. Soldiers who were going across country on troop trains would get off the trains and go into the canteen. The food, everything there was free, which is what made the Evansville Canteen unique. Elsewhere, they would have to pay a little something for coffee or for a piece of pie, that sort of thing. This one was free, so when some of the guys from Evansville would be overseas in France, England, wherever, they'd mention they were from Evansville, Indiana, invariably someone would say, "Oh, that's where that great canteen is."
War news around the world dominated the headlines, but the Courier kept close tabs on home front activities as well. The massive defense industry that built planes, ships, and bullets, and the little things that added up, scrap drives, bond drives, rationing. The Courier began running standing features that reported on assignments of tri-state people in uniform. Eventually, a daily column had to be added.
They also ran another standing feature, which was a casualty list, and it told the tri-state people who were killed or wounded or prisoners of war or missing in action. And they started out kind of as a trickle, the early part of the war. Then after June 6, 1944, when we invaded Normandy, that list grew dramatically.
With the war's end came the uneasy reconversion to a peacetime economy. Soldiers returned home looking for jobs, starting families, and building homes. Workers who had weathered the war under wage controls were demanding more, and the fear of communism skewed good judgment. Evansville was not spared this turbulent time.
The incumbent Congressman, Ed Mitchell, who had been brought in that landslide in 1946, and was also a member of the House Labor Committee, got one of his associates to bring the House Labor Committee to Evansville in September of 1948 and to conduct a hearing, which the Courier covered kind of unabashedly, naively, I might add, and the press also. But for day after day, you had people who claimed to be opposed to the leadership of the United Electrical Workers coming before this committee and saying the damnedest things about their neighbors and their co-workers, about their alleged links with the Communist Party, with very little opportunity for rebuttal or thorough examination of these charges. The Courier did a series subsequent to this on communists in Evansville. Virtually all of the evidence came anonymously on how the Communist Party got rooted in Evansville.
During the mid-50s, the Evansville area was shocked by a series of murders committed by Leslie Irvin. The Courier's coverage was sensational, with graphic photos, his confession, and liberal use of a moniker an official had given Irvin, Mad Dog. His conviction and death sentence were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in a precedent-setting decision that said newspaper coverage had created a climate that prevented Irvin from receiving a fair trial. He was convicted a second time and remained in prison the rest of his life. Among the reporters covering the Irvin case was Joe Aaron, who went on to write his morning assignment columns that became a breakfast-time habit for many tri-state readers.
Joe Aaron was he was probably the most beloved person I have ever experienced in the newspaper business. And I mean beloved on two levels, and I hope I can get through this because I still feel very strongly about Joe. He was so beloved by the staff, and that was shared to a large degree by his readers. They felt very strongly about him. I've never seen anyone who had quite as strong a readership as he did. People related to him so much because he was one of them. He was never anyone who, he never appreciated as an example his own abilities. He never thought he was a very good writer. And at one point, even came to me and said that he was going to have to quit. He was so discouraged at one point that he said he was going to have to quit. I almost laughed him out of the office because that was just inconceivable to have a Courier without Joe Aaron. But he was a very, very beloved individual. He also was one of the best writers and word craftsmen that I have ever seen in the business.
Aaron knew no bounds in pursuit of a column and found fertile ground in the seemingly insignificant.
Whether it was a large sunflower or a walk to Princeton, he would do whatever it took to get a good column.
But he just had a way of making you feel things, whether it was a sad story or a funny story. He could drive down a street and see a woman sitting on a porch singing a black hymn, and he could come back to the office and he could write 20 inches about it.
Aaron's humility was never more apparent than when Scripps Howard sold the Evening Press in 1986 and bought the Courier. He wondered if he still had a job, so he went to see his new boss, Tom Tooley.
Joe came over to see me one day, and his opening response was, "Do I have a job?" And I like to fell out of my chair because my opening response to him was going to be, "Joe, how much money do you need?"
October 27th, 1986, already was a stressful day. The staffs of the two newspapers were settling in under new ownership and management. Some were working for what had been the competition. Then, tragedy struck. Joe Aaron, at age 57, was struck down by a heart attack and died.
I could have sat down then and said, "Okay, today is the first day of the new operation. What's the worst thing that could happen to us today? In my worst nightmare, what is the worst thing that could happen in this operation?" It would have been Joe Aaron dying of a heart attack in the newsroom, which is exactly what happened at noon the first day. He was really the, I thought the soul of the Evansville Courier, and just, boy, like that it was gone.
The one thing I think that's kind of a bitter irony with Joe, though, is that he never really realized what a good writer he was. And people would tell him that, "Joe, you could go on and go to great things and go on to big city newspapers," and he stayed here in Evansville. And the irony, I think, is that the day that he died in the newsroom, the day that the newspaper was being sold to Scripps Howard, a chain which could have circulated his stories or syndicated his stories, that he died in the newsroom, and his stories could have gone all over the country and been enjoyed by people.
Another institution at the Courier was Dan Sissom, who was sports editor from 1925 through 1966.
Dan Sissom was a wonderful character, a wonderful sports editor, but also one of those characters that we've talked about. He had certain opinions, we might call them biases even, and he instituted them daily. I remember a famous story where he had someone had given him a wire story about Olympic skiing. And he said he wasn't going to have anything to do with that. He said, "There will be no skiing in my newspaper."
Excellent journalist and an excellent writer. And he was a pretty stern taskmaster, but once he jumped on you and said what he wanted to say and got his message across, well, then it was all forgotten, you know. He smoked a pipe and alternated that with a long back foul-smelling cigars, slender ones. And it always took him 4 or 5 matches to get either his pipe lit or the cigar lit, whichever one he was smoking. And he'd just toss the matches, you know. He'd puff around a while and then toss the matches. And he could hit the wastebasket all the time, and it was always full of paper. And Mike Bowles, one of our junior writers at the time, he said he spent the first 6 months at the Courier putting out wastebasket fires that Sissom set by throwing his spent matches in them.
Sissom was a powerful force in the sports community. He strongly favored the building of Roberts Stadium and founded the Courier City Golf Tournament. During his career, Sissom covered major professional golf tournaments, the World Series, the Kentucky Derby, and other major sporting events. He set the policy, continued under Flutie's leadership, of sending writers to cover local sports heroes, whether they were in the Rose Bowl, Super Bowl, or World Series. The sports department's emphasis on covering local heroes reflected the newspaper's overall news philosophy. While national and international news were important, Courier editors over the years have come to know that local news is what its readers want.
The Courier has always, in my experience, emphasized local copy. It had enough space that there was no dearth of national and international news, and there was some feeling on the part of people that I talked to in the public that we had perhaps too much of that, but nevertheless our emphasis always was on local coverage, and I think that was our strength.
When Bill Jackson came to the Courier in 1963, he found the newsroom staffed with reporters who could have stepped from the stage of the play Front Page.
There were a lot more characters at the newspaper in the 60s and maybe even into the 70s than there are now. I think we're a lot more businesslike today, and maybe I think we're a little more professional, to be honest about it. But in those days it was a little more fun, partly because of the type of people you had around. They were awfully unpredictable. I think part of the situation was that in those days we weren't particularly a well-paying newspaper, and as a result we didn't have a lot of choice when we came to hire people. The result of that, and the fact that in those days I think there was just more of a tendency of the business to draw colorful people, the result of all that was that we did have a lot of characters on the staff, and it was a lot of fun.
But he also found staff members who had built reputations and loyal readership, like longtime entertainment editor Gene Sir Heinrich and sports writer Don Bernhardt, who was associate sports editor when he died unexpectedly in 1983 at age 51.
Jeannie Sir Heinrich was an institution at the Courier. She had been there for many years by the time I got there, and I can very well recall that on the first day that I was there, she had a rather rough demeanor at times, and I was a young city editor, still wet behind the ears, and I saw her pronouncing judgment on something in the office, and I was about ready to go back to Texas, thinking that this is going to be too much for me to handle. In time, I saw what a sweet, wonderful person she was, and we became really good friends over a period of time. As far as her being the entertainment writer, she had a reputation in Evansville that I think it would be hard for anyone else to get. She had been here so long and was so well established and so well known, and her opinion was so well respected that she was just in a class by herself. Don Bernhardt was another institution at the Courier. He was someone who also had a great deal of respect from the staff. Everyone liked him. He was a very, very outgoing, amiable individual, and he also was an excellent, excellent sports writer.
Jackson was named editor of the Courier in 1978 during an effort to unionize the newsroom. The staff had become disgruntled over pay, working conditions, and a lack of resources needed to pursue the news.
My job was to convince the staff that the company did hear their concerns and that by bringing me back, they were trying to help solve those problems, and my job was to continue to do that.
The union effort was narrowly defeated, but it did catch the attention of the Courier board, including its chairwoman, Rosanna Enlow, Robert C. Enlow's widow.
Rosanna Enlow was not well known to the staff except for Christmas parties for many years. When her husband was alive, she was very uninvolved in the Courier. After his death, she became more involved, and I think it became clear then, if it hadn't been before, that she was very, very aware of the Courier, very interested in the Courier. It happened that at a time when she became more active in the Courier, there were some troubled times for the staff, and I think she was an inspiration to the staff. I think that they felt that she genuinely did care not only about the newspaper, but them, the staff. We set up meetings between the staff and with her, which I considered at the time was an unusual thing to be happening for the staff to be meeting directly with the publisher. But I felt that that showed the staff that she was concerned about them. I think she also, in addition to being an inspiration to the staff, it was very helpful to her, to us, that she realized that we had to have the financial means to operate the newsroom, and she was generous in the way she handled budgets, and I think we were able to improve during that period of time, partly because she was giving us the money that we needed in the newsroom.
On December 13th, 1977, the tri-state was shaken by the crash of a DC-3 charter plane that killed the University of Evansville's basketball team. The tragedy on that cool, misty night brought one of the most difficult assignments ever to the Courier staff.
It was something that you would imagine out of a war scene. It was, the flame was still burning, bodies were lined up along the tracks down there. It was real muddy and foggy. I remember a train whistle kind of cutting through that fog as they backed a rail car up to load the bodies onto that. It was really an eerie feeling. And at that point, I thought it might have just been, a charter plane with some business people on it. But as it turns out, as I walked up the side of a hill, I saw an Aces duffel bag, and I realized that what an impact that was going to have on the community. What an awful tragedy, even worse tragedy, when all those young people had lost their lives.
I don't think there's probably anything that's ever had more impact on me in terms of a news event. The scene was just, I think we were all numb from what we saw. Up on an embankment, you could see the tail of the plane and some wreckage. And then the railroad tracks ran through there. And the bodies had been covered, but you could still see duffel bags and tennis shoes and other things that belonged to the team. There was one player on that plane crash who survived for a few hours, 5 hours. His name was Greg Smith. And years later, on the 10th anniversary, I interviewed his parents, drove over to Illinois and talked to them about that night. And I can still remember his father crying as he was telling me they had driven several hours to get to Evansville that night, not knowing if their son was alive or dead. They went to the morgue downtown and thinking that he was dead, and they were told he's alive. And that he was at Deaconess Hospital. And his father said that they got to the hospital when they could finally find it. They didn't know where anything was in Evansville. And they got to the hospital, and their son had died 5 minutes before. So talking to families and people who've gone through something traumatic like that is very difficult, because you have to show compassion, and you just have to feel what they're going through and be very careful in how you ask questions.
Lessons the Courier staff learned in covering the Aces plane crash served it well when major stories broke in following years. The murder of the Patrick Gilligan family, the slaying of former Mayor Russell Lloyd, and the crash of a C-130 military plane. The January 25, 1978 blizzard that crippled the tri-state presented the newspaper with new challenges in gathering and delivering the news. It also found the Courier staff stranded in the office.
The reporters did an incredible job, I thought, getting the information together, calling police and people all over the tri-state, getting information on the storm. But once the paper was put to bed, it came time to kind of bed down in the newsroom, and I still remember people sleeping every which way, on desktops, against radiators. Some of us slept and some of us didn't.
The whole staff was going to meet at the Peephole Tavern for breakfast. And Rich and I braved the wind to get down there and found that we were the only two there. We couldn't imagine where everybody else was. So we presumed that they had made it to the executive inn, so we're darting in and out of doorways down Main Street trying to stay out of the wind, and finally inched our way to the executive. Found that we, again, were the only Courier staff members there, so we had our breakfast and then inched our way back to the office trying to avoid the cold. When we got back there, still the rest of the staff, mainly it was some of the sports writers, weren't around. We learned that they had gotten about a half a block, got too cold, darted into the YWCA and became the first males ever to sleep at the YWCA. They got a hot breakfast and a warm bed, and I was rather jealous of them after hearing their story.
In 1986, the Courier, after more than 140 years of local ownership, was sold to the national chain Scripps Howard. In order to buy the morning paper, Scripps Howard had to sell the evening press it had published in Evansville since 1906.
Well, I think there were a couple of things that really led to the change of ownership that took place in 1986. One of the things I think clearly was that we had all come to the place where we knew that we needed a new facility. We needed a new building, we needed new presses, and I think there was maybe some reluctance on the part of the Courier's owners at the time into getting into that big of a capital expense. On the other hand, the press's owner, which then was Scripps Howard, was very anxious to get into the morning market.
Former rivals suddenly became allies in the Courier newsroom. The alliance was uneasy at best.
It was really a very traumatic, stressful time. You know, you had two newspapers who basically were extremely aggressive rivals and had been for years. People didn't particularly like each other at the other newspaper. And all of a sudden, ownership changed, editors flip-flopped, people flip-flopped. You know, overnight, I took over a Courier newsroom, a morning newspaper, which I had never run before in my life, and had about half of the people were former Courier staffers and half the people were former press staffers, none of whom trusted each other, none of whom liked each other, and they were sitting right next to each other in desks now and told to do this job together.
Changes in the local newspaper industry continued, highlighted in 1990 by the completion of a new $25 million headquarters and printing facility at Walnut and Heidelbach.
One of the reasons that, as I've already pointed out, that the ownership change came about in 1986 was because everybody realized that we needed to move into a construction phase. The building we were in was too small. You know, we had outgrown it years and years before. We were putting money into a facility that was not going to last. The roof leaked, the floor was crumbling, the desks were broken, the chairs were broken. The printing presses, part of which we had purchased used 20 years before, had gone far beyond their lifetime. It was a poorly printed product. And the time came that we just had to do something.
The new building brought new equipment that put the Courier Company on the cutting edge in printing technology.
We thought, and still do, that the printing presses were the very best product on earth to buy. We thought the color separating equipment, the Cytex equipment that we're using, absolutely top of the line. And we were able to purchase this kind of equipment that really put us on the cutting edge of newspaper technology. And I think it's showing up in our product today and showing up in a lot of the things that we're doing.
In the near future, newspapers, including the Courier, will provide information to its readers in a variety of forms. They will include the printed version they receive today, an electronic report they can receive on their computers at home, and another product on their televisions.
What I see happening is that we're going to be involved in half a dozen different ways to deliver information. You can call it a newspaper, you can call it online, you can call it a tablet, you can call it television, you can call it whatever you want. But we will still be doing essentially the same reporting, the same editing, and the same packaging of information. We'll simply be sending it out a half a dozen different ways. Some people will want it just like they get it today, a newspaper. Some people want it another way. We need to be ready, and we're heading in those directions to supply that information in a variety of ways. And, you know, I think we'll certainly be here another 150 years. We'll be different, but, you know, we're different today than we were 150 years ago, too.